morning, everyone. Hello, Catalina. Hello, Kyle. Hello, John. And hello, Bante. Thank you for coming to share Dharma tirelessly every morning and every evening. So today we will be studying the Madhupiṇḍika Sutta. So I believe there is a link at the top of the live chat that you can click and follow along as Bante goes through it. Then there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the sutta analysis. So feel free to write any questions you might have on the live chat, and Bante will get to them later. So we still have 1 minute or so. So waiting for other people to show up and connect online. Okay, it's 8 a.m. Hello, Matthew. It's 8 a.m., so I believe we can start with the sutta.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammam sangham namassam. Okay, good morning again, everyone. I'm so happy that you're still joining us for sutta study. So it's a really important part of our practice to read the Buddha's words and to try to understand them and to make an effort to apply them to our lives. So this is a really important part of our practice, is connecting with the suttas, connecting with the Buddhist scriptures, with the ancient discourses, and really making an effort to read the suttas not just as an intellectual exercise, but as a framework for our daily practice. So looking at the suttas and asking ourselves, how does this apply to my lived experience? How can I relate this to my everyday experience? Because the Dhamma is not just relevant in ancient India 2,500 years ago at a different time and place. The Dhamma is timeless. It's akaliko. It's timeless. It's not dependent upon a particular time and place. It's relevant everywhere at all times for all sentient beings. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and plunge into this discourse because it's a bit of a complex one. So I want to make sure we have enough time to properly dig through it. As mentioned, we'll be going through the Madhupiṇḍika Sutta, which is in Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 18. It's translated as the lump of honey. The sutta doesn't have anything to do with honey, by the way. At the end of the sutta, it explains why it has this name. Long story short, it's because the sutta is sweet. It's delicious. It's satisfying. You may have a different experience, but that's why it's called the lump of honey. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling among the Sakyans at Kapilavatthu in the Banyan Park. Then, after dressing in the morning and taking his woolen robe, the Blessed One entered Kapilavatthu for alms. After going for alms in Kapilavatthu and returning from alms round, after his meal, he approached the great grove for the day's abiding. After plunging into the great grove, he sat at the root of a young Belava tree for the day's abiding. Dandapani, the Sakyan, while walking and wandering about for exercise, approached the great grove. After plunging into the great grove, he approached the young Belava tree where the Blessed One was seated. After approaching, he exchanged greetings with the Blessed One. After engaging in the customary polite speech, he stood to one side, leaning on his staff. While he was leaning to one side, Dandapani the Sakyan said to the Blessed One, "What is the contemplative's doctrine? What is his declaration?" So this is the build-up to the sutta. So it starts off quite ordinarily. The Buddha goes for alms, he has his meal, and then he goes into the forest and sits down at the root of the tree for the day. Then Dandapani the Sakyan, so this is someone from the same clan that the Buddha was born in, so this was probably a distant relative of the Buddha, though the discourse doesn't tell us exactly what their relation is, if any. But they were probably distant cousins of some sort. So Dandapani goes into the forest and sees the Buddha, and while standing there leaning on his staff, he says, "What is the contemplative's doctrine? What is his declaration?" So this is, again, the way he's speaking to the Buddha indicates that Dandapani was not himself Buddhist, because he's speaking to the Buddha in a way that would be considered a little bit disrespectful, a little bit rude. Also, the fact that he was asking the Buddha questions while standing up and leaning on his staff, again, this would have been considered rude. The proper thing to do would be to sit down, put down his staff, and then to ask his question from a seated position. So the Buddha then answers Dandapani's question in a very unusual and interesting way. So the Buddha says, "Venerable," first off, it's notable that even though Dandapani was not being very polite to the Buddha replied with a polite term of address. He says, "Venerable, my doctrine is such that no one in the world with its angels, demons, gods, contemplatives, and priests, in this generation with its celestial and human beings, can argue with me. It is such that identifications do not persist in the subconscious of a holy man dwelling unbound by sensuality, free of doubt, with restlessness cut off, and without craving for existence or non-existence. This is my doctrine, Venerable. This is my declaration." When this was said, Dandapani the Sakyan shook his head, wagged his tongue, and raised his eyebrows, wrinkling his forehead into 3 lines. Then he left, leaning on his staff. In other words, Dandapani was like, "I have no idea what any of that means." So he was perplexed and confused and bewildered and wandered off. But taking a bit of a closer look at what the Buddha said here. First off, he said that his doctrine is such that nobody in the world can argue with him. So he's first making this statement. He's saying, what I say, what I teach is incontrovertible. It can't be denied. It can't be rejected. It can't be argued with. He says, nobody can reject or argue with this teaching. Not even angels, demons, and gods, let alone ordinary human beings. Nobody can argue with this. And he says that someone who practices in accordance with his teachings he says, identifications do not persist in their subconscious. So let me see what the Pali word here. So it's sanya nanu senti. So sanya is translated here as identifications. So the sanya also refers to perceptual filtering, the way that we filter and rewrite our experience, the way that we distort our experience. So another way you could translate this is perceptual distortions do not persist in the subconscious of a holy person. So someone who's practicing the Buddha's teachings no longer has any perceptual distortions. And he emphasizes here that someone who practices his teachings dwells unbound by sensuality, so they're not caught with any kind of sensual experiences. So sensual experiences don't trap them in the cycle of desire and attachment that the rest of us tend to get trapped in. This person is free of doubt. In other words, they clearly see reality as it is, which means they no longer have any doubt. So one of the aspects of the Buddha's teachings is that there are things which we can see and confirm for ourselves through our own experience. We don't need to rely upon blind faith, which therefore means that we don't need to worry about doubt, because we can know the truth of the Buddha's words for ourselves. So just as surely as we can know that our body is sitting here because we feel it for ourselves, in the same way we can know the truth of the Buddha's words because we feel and see them for ourselves. And with restlessness cut off, so there's no agitation in the mind is not agitated. And there's a few places in the sutras where the Buddha equates a mind free of agitation with awakening. So agitation or restlessness, it's sometimes used in this ordinary way of like the ordinary everyday agitation and restlessness, like when you're really bored or really excited, then you feel agitated and restless, or if you're really upset, you feel agitated and restless. It's kind of the ordinary common way. So agitation then is also one of the 5 hindrances to meditation practice. So again, that's referring to this ordinary everyday agitation. So letting go of that and coming to some kind of basic serenity, basic peacefulness is necessary to get good concentration, good samadhi. But sometimes agitation also refers to this much deeper, more foundational trembling in the mind, which is based upon our clinging to a sense of self. It's based on our desperately trying to hold on to our sense of self-identity, despite the fact that everything we experience directly contravenes that belief. So that creates this subtle trembling in the mind, this subtle disturbance in the mind. And finally, the last quality that the Buddha mentions here for the spiritual practitioner is without craving for existence or non-existence. So in Pali, this is very brief. Bhavabhave vita tanham. Bhavabhave vita tanham. So vita, without, tanha, craving, for existence, bhava, or non-existence, abhava. So not craving to be and not craving to cease to be. Not craving for any particular state of existence, but also not trying to avoid any state of existence. But Dandapani was just like, WTF, I have no idea what this guy is talking about, and left. So Dandapani didn't get it. So continuing with the sutta, the Buddha says, then when the Blessed One emerged from retreat in the evening, he approached the banyan park. After approaching, he sat on the designated seat. After sitting, the Blessed One addressed the monks. Here, monks, after I dressed in the morning and took my bowl and robe, and then the Buddha explains what happened, how he went for alms and then went to the forest, and then Dandapani asked his question, and the Buddha gave his beautiful reply, followed by Dandapani leaving, perplexed and leaning on his staff. When this was said, a certain monk said to the Blessed One, Bhante, what is the Blessed One's doctrine, such that no one in the world with its angels, demons, gods, contemplatives, and priests, in this generation with its celestial and human beings, can argue with him? And, Bhante, how do perceptual distortions not persist in the subconscious of a holy person dwelling unbound by sensuality, free of doubt, with restlessness cut off, and without craving for existence or non-existence. In other words, the monk is asking, so what is it that the Buddha teaches that can be described in this way? Because it's interesting that the Buddha's answer, he doesn't actually directly state what his doctrine is. He just says, he talks about the characteristics of the Dhamma. No, he talks about the effect that it has on someone. But he didn't actually directly say what his teaching is. Though from what he says based on its effects, one could derive much about the nature of the Buddha's teachings. But the Buddha was speaking in this rather indirect way, which once again was probably because of the disrespectful way that Dandapani was asking his question. So rather than give a direct reply, the Buddha gave an indirect answer. So then the Buddha replies, monk, from whatever source identification and conceptualization based on proliferation beset a person, if there is nothing there to be delighted in, welcomed and attached to, then just this is the end of the subconscious tendency towards aversion. Just this is the end of the subconscious tendency towards passion. Just this is the end of the subconscious tendency towards aversion. Just this is the end of the subconscious tendency towards perspectives. Just this is the end of the subconscious tendency towards doubt. Just this is the end of the subconscious tendency towards conceit. Just this is the end of the subconscious tendency towards the lust for existence. Just this is the end of the subconscious tendency towards ignorance. Just this is the end of the raising of cudgels, the raising of swords, dispute, conflict, contention, blame, malice, and lies. Here, these harmful, unwholesome phenomena cease without remainder. This is what the Blessed One said. After saying this, the Sublime One rose from his seat and entered his dwelling. Did you get that? No? Nope. Okay. So one of our residents is quite vigorously shaking her head. No, she did not understand. And that's okay, because the rest of the sutta is all about explaining this paragraph, this statement that the Buddha just said. So I'll speak about it a little bit, but more importantly is then to go on and get the explanation that's delivered later on. So first off, the central phrase of this is papañca sanya sankha, which I had translated here as identification and conceptualization based on proliferation. But as I mentioned earlier, in this sutta, the word sanya appears to mean not just identification in the ordinary sense of us identifying what we see and hear and so on, but specifically distortion of our experience. So perceptual distortion. The way that we misinterpret and rewrite and distort our experiences of the world based upon our underlying tendencies, based upon our subconscious habits. So mental perceptual distortion, identification, sanya, perceptual distortion, and sankha, which is translated here as conceptualization. Sankha is what we conceive things to be, the ideas and concepts that we have about things. So something happens, we have some experience, and then in our mind, we form a concept, an idea, an abstraction based upon our experience. And the problem is that we believe in our distorted perceptions and we believe in our abstract concepts, even though they're often quite dramatically different from our actual experience. So we believe in these stories that we tell in our mind, the stories that we tell ourselves about our experiences, even though they're often badly distorted and quite inaccurate. We believe the stories that we tell ourselves. And these stories that we tell ourselves, these perceptual distortions, these abstract concepts, they're based on papañca. So papañca is translated here as proliferation, so mental proliferation. So this is a tendency to build up these complex stories and ideas in our mind as a basis for how we understand the world. So our understanding of the world is based upon this growth and expansion of inaccurate stories and ideas in our mind based upon perceptual distortions and abstract concepts divorced from reality. So it's kind of again, it's like a disease. So one virus or bacteria lands in your body and then starts proliferating, starts spreading. And in a very short period of time, it can take over your whole body. So in the same way, with mental proliferation, we start with one distorted perception, one misguided concept, and then we build on it and expand it until it takes over our whole mind. But the Buddha says, if there is nothing there to be delighted in, welcomed, and attached to, so if we don't delight in mental proliferation, perceptual distortions, and groundless concepts, if we don't delight in them, we don't welcome them, and we don't attach to them, then just that will cut off our subconscious tendency towards passion, aversion, false perspectives, doubt, conceit, lust for existence, ignorance, and all forms of violence, malice, and lies. So this is basically what the Buddha is saying in this opening paragraph here. And this serves the framework for the rest of the sutta. So then, not long after the Blessed One left, it occurred to those monks, Venerables, after giving this brief statement, the Blessed One rose from his seat and entered his dwelling without explaining its meaning in detail. And they repeat what the Buddha said. And they ask, who might explain in detail the meaning of this brief statement that the Blessed One gave without explaining its meaning in detail? Then it occurred to those monks, Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna is praised and esteemed by the teacher and by wise companions in the holy life. Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna is able to explain the meaning of this brief statement that the Blessed One gave without explaining its meaning in detail. Perhaps we could approach Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna. After approaching him, we could ask him about the meaning of this. So Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna was a monk who the Buddha said was the best at explaining in detail brief statements. So he's the best at analyzing in detail the meaning of a statement. So then those monks approached Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna and exchanged greetings with him. After engaging in the customary polite speech, they sat to one side. When they were seated to one side, those monks said to Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna, Venerable Kaccana, after giving this brief statement to us, the Blessed One rose from his seat and entered his dwelling without explaining its meaning in detail. And they repeat the statement that the Buddha said. Venerable Kaccana, not long after the Blessed One left, it occurred to us, and they go through the same thing they just said, so coming to the conclusion that they should ask Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna. And then they say, let Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna explain it to us. And Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna replies, Venerables, just like a man who needed heartwood, who was seeking heartwood, who was going in search of heartwood, was by a large tree which had heartwood, and he neglected the root and trunk, and instead thought that heartwood was to be sought for in the branches and leaves. In the same way, when the Venerables were in front of the teacher, they neglected the Blessed One and thought that I was to be asked about the meaning of this. For Venerables, knowing, the Blessed One knows. Seeing, he sees. He has become vision. He has become knowledge. He has become Dhamma. He has become divine. He is the initiator and the continuer. He is the guide to the meaning. He is the giver of the deathless. He is the Dhamma master. He is the truth finder. And that was the time for this. You could have asked the Blessed One about the meaning of this. You could have remembered it according to the way that the Blessed One would have explained it to you. So Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna starts by scolding the monks. He's like, why didn't you just ask the Buddha what he meant by this? Why did you come and ask me this question? So he gives this simile of a tree. And so the simile here is that the trunk of the tree is the Buddha. So that's where you find the best wood. So the trunk of the tree is where you find the best wood. And so all the Buddha's disciples are like the branches and leaves. And branches and leaves don't have particularly good wood. They're just sticks and leaves. So Maha Kaccana is asking, why are you searching among the sticks and leaves for good wood when we walked right past the best part of the tree? Like, why are you searching for answers among the Buddha's disciples when you could have asked the Buddha himself? So this is especially relevant to us who are practicing after the Buddha has already passed away, because we don't have the option of going directly to the Buddha. So these monks were actually in the Buddha's presence, and they didn't ask him any questions. Like, what a wasted opportunity. So Maha Kaccana is like, you guys wasted your opportunity to ask the Buddha questions about his own teachings. Very foolish, not good. And I also find the series of epithets, the series of names for the Buddha that he gives here, really delightful. So he says, the Blessed One has become vision. He has become knowledge. He has become Dhamma. He has become divine. He is the initiator and the continuer. That's the initiator and the continuer of the teachings. He is the guide to the meaning. He is the giver of the deathless. So the deathless is another name for Nibbana, or full enlightenment, complete awakening. He is the Dhamma master. He is the truth finder. So truth finder is how the word Tathagata has been translated in this sutta. So carrying on with the sutta, then the monks reply, certainly Venerable Kaccana, knowing the Blessed One knows, and they repeat all the things that Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna said in praise of the Buddha. They say, and that was the time for this. We could have asked the Blessed One about the meaning of this. As the Blessed One would have explained it to us, we could have remembered it. However, Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna is praised and esteemed by the teacher and by wise companions in the holy life. Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna is able to explain in detail the meaning of this brief statement that the Blessed One gave without explaining its meaning in detail. Let Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna explain it to us, if it is not burdensome. And so Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna agrees. He says, therefore, Venerables, listen and carefully pay attention. I will speak. Yes, Venerable, those monks replied to Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna. Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna said this. Brace yourselves. This can be a little bit hard to follow. So, he says, Venerables, dependent upon an I and a visible object, I consciousness arises. The combination of the three is sense contact. Because of sense contact, there is feeling. What one feels, one identifies. What one identifies, one thinks about. What one thinks about, one proliferates about. What one proliferates about, with that as its source, identification and conception based on proliferation beset a man in regard to visible objects cognizable by the eye in the past, present, and future. And he goes through the same sequence with ear and sound, nose and fragrance, tongue and taste, body and tactile objects, and mind and mental objects. So with each one of these, he goes through the same thing. So there's the sense organ, and the sense object. Based on those, sense consciousness arises. And the three together is sense contact. So this is the basic way that we have a sensory experience. So again, the first example he gives, we have eyes, and there are things to be seen. So based upon that, we have eye consciousness. So the awareness of a visual world. Based upon awareness of a visual world, then we have the experience of seeing things. So that's sense contact. The experience, I am seeing those things. Based on sense contact, there arises feeling, Vedana, which in Pali simply means the experience of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So it's the automatic, or it's actually not automatic, but the almost automatic value judgment that we place on any sensory experience. We either find it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, kind of automatic or almost automatic response. Then whatever we're sensing and whatever we're feeling, then we form a sanya, which in the sutta is translated as identification. But as I mentioned earlier, it seems in this discourse to have the particular meaning of perceptual distortion. So a distorted perception, a misidentification, a misperception of our experience. And so based upon that identification of our sense contact, based upon that distorted perception of what we're sensing, then we start thinking. We start thinking about whatever we're sensing, whatever our mental distortion about what we're sensing is. We start thinking about it. And then based upon those thoughts, then we proliferate. So like the thinking about it is like the initial onset of the disease, and then the proliferation is when it spreads through the whole mind. We fill the mind with this. So I remember in a biology class in high school, at one point they had us do this very simple experiment where you take a little petri dish. It's like a little dish filled with like basic nutriment, basic food, and you put like a little drop of bacteria in the middle of it, and then you put it in a proper place, like a warm, safe place for a few days, and you would check it every day and see what's going on. And in the beginning, there would just be a little white dot in the middle of the petri dish, a little white dot in the middle of the food base. And then the second day, the white dot is maybe slightly bigger, and the third day, it's a little bit bigger. But then after a few days, it's spread to consume the entire dish, and you've got this thick, fuzzy goo all over the inside of the dish. So in the beginning, it's just one little dot, and it starts slowly spreading, and then within a very short period of time, it's completely consumed the entire surface, the entire container. So it's the same with mental proliferation. We start with a sensory experience, then we form a distorted idea, a distorted misperception of what that sensory experience is, and then we start thinking about it. And within a very short period of time, our mind is completely overrun, completely consumed by all of this internal noise, this chaotic, messy, unpleasant disaster inside our mind. This is what not to do, by the way, in case that's not clear. So then Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna goes on. He says, Venerables, when there is an I, a visible object, and I consciousness, it is possible that one could point out a manifestation of sense contact. When there is a manifestation of sense contact, it is possible that one could point out feeling. When there is a manifestation of feeling, it is possible that one could point out thought. When there is a manifestation of thought, it is possible that one could point out the onset of identification and conceptualization based on proliferation. And he goes through the same sequence with the other senses. So this is just a slightly more complex way of saying basically the same thing. So previously he was saying dependent upon the one, then there is the next one. Here he's saying when there is the one, it is possible to point out the next one. It is possible to indicate the existence of the next step in this chain. So he's just stating it in slightly more flowery language, but the meaning is basically the same. Now we get into the fun part. Well, actually, it's all fun. It's just different shades and varieties of fun. Is everybody else loving this? Lots of fun. Yes, okay, I see one enthusiastic smile, another smile, another person who looks like she's sleeping. Okay. So two of us are having fun, and one of us is having half fun, and the other one is hopefully meditating rather than sleeping. Okay. So then Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna says, Venerables, when there is no I, no visible object, and no I consciousness, it is possible that it is impossible, it is not possible, that one could point out a manifestation of sense contact. When there is no manifestation of sense contact, it is impossible that one could point out feeling. When there is no manifestation of feeling, it is impossible that one could point out thought. When there is no manifestation of thought, it is impossible that one could point out the onset of identification and conceptualization based on proliferation. Venerables, when there is no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. So going through the same, no mental object, no mind consciousness. It is impossible that one could point out a manifestation of sense contact. When there is no manifestation of sense contact, it is impossible that one could point out feeling. When there is no manifestation of feeling, it is impossible that one could point out thought. When there is no manifestation of thought, it is impossible that one could point out the onset of identification and conceptualization based on proliferation. So those of you who are familiar with the Heart Sutra might find some familiarity also with this paragraph here. So when there is no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no sight, no sound, no smell, no taste, no touch, no mental objects, no eye consciousness, no ear consciousness, no nose consciousness, no tongue consciousness, no body consciousness, no mind consciousness. So this is one of the central parts of the Heart Sutra. It's saying that fundamentally, in emptiness, in absolute reality, there is no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. There is no sight, no sound, no smell, no taste, no touch, no mental objects. There is no sensory consciousness of any of these six kinds. So Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna is saying that when we recognize that ultimately there is no eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, no sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, mental object, then we don't get caught up in sense contact. And since we don't get caught up in sense contact, then we don't get caught up in feeling. And when we don't get caught up in feeling, then we don't produce any kind of perceptual distortions. And since we don't produce any kind of perceptual distortions, we don't get caught up in thinking about those perceptual distortions. And since we're not getting caught up in thought, then we don't get caught up in mental proliferation. So we don't fall into this whole mess in the first place. So recognizing that what we think of as substantial, permanent, and solid is actually insubstantial, impermanent, not solid, then this whole process is cut off right from the beginning. So when we recognize the inherent insubstantiality the lack of substance in the six senses, then we don't get caught in the cycle that leads to proliferation. We don't get caught in the cycle that leads to the mind being completely overrun by this internal disease of proliferation based upon perceptual distortion and conceptualization. So then Maha Kaccana continues, Venerables, regarding the brief statement which the Blessed One gave to you, after which he rose from his seat and entered his dwelling without explaining its meaning in detail. He repeats the Buddha's statement. Venerables, as I understand it, this is the detailed meaning of the brief statement which the Blessed One gave. If the Venerables wish, they may approach the Blessed One and ask him about the meaning. You may remember it according to the way that the Blessed One explains it to you. Then those monks, after delighting and rejoicing in Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna's speech, rose from their seats and approached the Blessed One. After approaching and paying respects to the Blessed One, they sat to one side. When they were seated to one side, those monks said to the Blessed One, and they reported to the Buddha the whole thing that happened through the end of Venerable Mahā-Kaccāna's explanation. And the Buddha replies, Monks, Maha Kaccana is wise. Monks, Maha Kaccana has great wisdom. Monks, if you had asked me about the meaning of this, I would have explained it in the same way that Maha Kaccana explained it. That is the meaning of it. Remember it in this way. When this was said, Venerable Ananda said to the Blessed One, Bhante, just as a person who is afflicted with hunger and weakness came upon a lump of honey. Wherever he tasted it, he would get a pleasant and pure taste. In the same way, Bhante, wherever a competent monk investigates with wisdom the meaning of this Dhamma discourse, he would get satisfaction. He would gain confidence of mind. Bhante, what is the name of this Dhamma discourse? The Buddha replies, therefore, Ananda, remember this Dhamma discourse as the lump of honey discourse. That's the Madhupiṇḍika Sutta. This is what the Blessed One said. Satisfied, Venerable Ananda delighted in the Blessed One's speech. So that's it for this sutta. So very short, intense, and potent, just like a ball of honey, and also very sweet and delightful and delicious, just like a ball of honey. So I see Ayasoma smiling and nodding because she likes honey. And she also likes Dhamma, so I'm sure she appreciates this sutta. So at this time, we have an opportunity for further questions and discussion. Unless you're currently baffled and wagging your head and puckering your forehead into 3 lines and walking away leaning on a staff, then you might have some questions or inquiries, something further that you want to explore or discuss about the sutta. Do we have any questions?
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So, first of all, we have quite a few people that are saying hello. Hello, Ella, Claudia, Michelle, Sarah, Cam, Yudi, Tsai, Artifacts, Junie, Marielle, Jessica, Junie again. They're all very enthusiastic about the sutta, so this is all great. And Yudi has a question. She's saying, I thought sana is sensation and vijnana is perception. Nope.
So sanya, it's most commonly translated as perception, but the meaning of the word is a little bit closer to recognition or identification. So most commonly, the word sanya is part of the 5 aggregates, the 5 khandhas, the 5 components of body and mind. And it stands between Vedana, which is feeling, the immediate feeling of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, and Sankhara, which is thoughts and mental activities. So sanya is after we've had a sensory experience, then we identify it. We put a label on it. We decide what it is. So, for example, you see a collection of shapes and colors. That's sensation. You perceive it as pleasant. So that's sanya. Oh, sorry, that's not sanya. That's Vedana. You perceive it as pleasant. That's Vedana. And then you identify it as a cat. You think, that is a cat. I am seeing a cat. That's sanya. But then you turn and look more closely and you realize that it's actually a raccoon, because your sanya was distorted and incorrect at first. And then maybe on recognizing that it's a raccoon, then your pleasant feeling changes to an unpleasant feeling. Because maybe you remember when a raccoon killed one of your chickens, so you have a negative association with raccoons. So our sanya, our identification process, is often distorted and incorrect. In fact, from a Buddhist standpoint, if you're not fully enlightened, then your sanya is guaranteed to be incorrect. You're guaranteed to be misunderstanding the nature of reality. And that's because we're constantly filtering our experience of reality through our underlying beliefs about what we think reality is. We're constantly filtering our sensations through our belief in permanence, our belief that things are lasting, that there are solid, persistent objects which we interact with. We're filtering the world through our belief in pleasure, through our belief that if we get what we want, then that will make us happy, that there are things in the world which are inherently pleasurable, and that therefore are worth pursuing. And we're filtering the world through our belief in self-existence, through our basic belief, I exist as a separate independent being who is experiencing objects outside of myself. So since we're constantly filtering our sensations through these misunderstandings, these underlying delusions and defilements, then our sanya, our identification of things, our recognition of things, is distorted. It's incorrect. So the sutta ultimately is all about distorted perceptions of reality and how those distorted perceptions lead to the mind getting absolutely dominated by diseased thinking, proliferations. That's what he's talking about here. So yeah, sanya is perception, identification, recognition. And in the sutta, it's particularly referring to distorted perception, misidentification of our sensations. Okay.
Thank you, Bhante. And Yuri says again, that would be perception to identify. But before the identification, there is a sensation. At least that's what I've learned.
Yes. Yeah. So there's the raw, direct sensation. But the raw, direct sensation has no names, no labels, no concepts. So, for example, when hearing, it's just sound waves contacting the ear. That's it. But then later on, a little bit later, we tell ourselves, oh, that pleasant sound is the sound of Beethoven. It's Beethoven's Emperor Concerto. It's Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, or whatever it is. But that's just a story that we're telling ourselves. In actuality, it's just sound waves hitting the ear. So the direct experience, the direct sensory experience, is prior to the identification of the experience. It's prior to the labeling of the experience. And so through practicing mindfulness and concentration, you can get to a point of feeling sensory experiences without forming concepts about them. So you can have the experience of sensation without sanya. You can notice what it is to directly sense something without putting concepts between you and the sensation. It's possible. But it takes very strong mindfulness and very strong samadhi. But you can do it. It can be done. Okay? Anything else?
Yes, Kam asks, Bhante, you mentioned the Heart Sutra, which says form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Is this what this sutta is about, regards to no ear, no eye, etc.?
That's certainly one way of interpreting it. So one thing that you'll find with this particular sutta is that there's a lot of different people who have explained it in their own particular ways. So don't just go on my explanation of things. I encourage you always to see what other teachers have to say, to explore other viewpoints and perspectives, and see what you might find in them. But yeah, my understanding when in the Heart Sutra, when it says form is emptiness, emptiness is form. So first off, he's going through the 5 khandhas. So saying that so body, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Each one of these 5 is emptiness, and emptiness is each one of these 5. So he's pointing to the fact that what we perceive as distinct objects fundamentally do not exist as separate objects of their own. So that's just a way that we parse out absolute reality into the appearance of distinct objects, but that fundamentally there are no distinct objects. Fundamentally, there is formlessness, but we impose the idea of distinct separate objects onto that formlessness. So fundamentally, there's not any permanent, solid, existing objects, but we impose the idea of solid, permanent, existing objects onto that formlessness. So that is also what is being spoken about here. So he's speaking about how we have there's some kind of experience, and then from that experience, then we impose all kinds of concepts and ideas, which then leads to our mind filling up with a bunch of nonsense. So this, it is in fact a very similar thing to what's being spoken about in the Heart Sutra. It's just coming at it in a slightly different way. But yeah, it's speaking about basically the same concepts.
Thank you. And Mehmet asks, thank you very much. How does the proliferation lead to tanha?
So first off, I would say that the proliferation, to some extent, is arising from tanha. So we have some form of craving for experience, craving for personal experience, craving for particular kinds of experience. We also have deep attachment to our habitual ways of perceiving the world, our habitual ways of filtering our experience. So there's a desire to continue experiencing the world in a comfortable and familiar way, which closes us off to having any kind of unusual experience, any kind of dramatically different experience of the world than what we're used to. But then also, as the mind starts to fill up with proliferation, a lot of that proliferation is related to I want. As the mind fills up with concepts and ideas about reality, we also start separating it into the things that I want and the things that I don't want. The things that I like and therefore want to get, the things that I dislike and therefore want to avoid. So this is also recognizing that proliferation then fuels our tanha, because it's continually piling up the view of self. It's continually piling up the view of other. It's continually piling up the underlying delusion that we can get things which will make us happy. And it gives us the space and the opportunity to keep building up our craving, to keep adding more and more to that momentum of I want. So it's kind of like when you have a crowd If you've ever been to a rally of any kind where like the person leading the rally starts to get everybody yelling or chanting at the same time, and it starts off just kind of moderately loud, but then as people get into it, it like progressively builds and builds and builds. It's like that with proliferation in our mind. In our mind, we're like, I want, I want, I want, I want, I want, I want. So it just builds and builds and builds and builds because we keep building it up. So that's the proliferation process. So in the example here, for example, there is I, there is sight, there is eye consciousness. So this is sense contact, eye contact. There's a feeling, which in this case, let's say it's a pleasant feeling. Based on that pleasant feeling, there's some kind of perceptual distortion. There's the manifestation of sanya. There's the manifestation of this perception or identification or recognition process. And then we start thinking about it. It's like, oh, I'm having a sensation that is pleasant. Then we start telling ourselves a story about it. Or we start launching off in all kinds of directions related to pleasant visual experiences. Maybe we tell ourselves stories about getting what we're looking at, or doing things with what we're looking at, or doing things with things similar to what we're looking at, or memories of times when we did things that were pleasant, that were vaguely similar to what we're currently thinking about, and then thinking about those other times when we tried to get something similar to what we're thinking about, which is related to something similar to what we're seeing. So it just builds and builds into this vast internal network of what we like and what we dislike, and how we can get what we want, and how we can avoid what we don't want, and how we can, if we just get more of what we want, then life will be more pleasant. And if we can just keep avoiding the stuff that we don't want, then we'll avoid the unpleasantness. So the mind just starts spinning out into these cycles of craving. These cycles of craving, which ultimately, when you trace it back to its source, it's just based upon an instant of seeing something. And Venerable Kaccāna is saying, and actually there's not even that. There's not even a something that's being seen. So we've built this whole internal hurricane of craving and aversion based upon a misperception of reality. A misperception that I am seeing an object. This fundamental misunderstanding of reality. And from that, we build this whole internal hurricane of agitation and unpleasantness. So that's how proliferation fuels our craving. Okay? Anything else?
Thank you. Yes, John asks, do we have any power over how we feel about sensation? If so, is it better to relate to a sensation as neutral than as pleasant or unpleasant?
So there's a number of places in the suttas where the Buddha says, yes, someone who has sufficiently developed their mind, he says someone who has sufficiently developed their mind has the power to perceive the pleasant as unpleasant, or to perceive the unpleasant as pleasant, or to transcend both pleasant and unpleasant, and to perceive all things as neutral with a peaceful mind. But this requires substantial development of mind. It requires that one be able to recognize a sensation prior to the arising of Vedana. And that's very difficult because the process of Vedana, the process by which we label something pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, is extremely fast. It's very, very deeply rooted in the subconscious. So it's very, very difficult to catch the process between sensation and Vedana. But as the Buddha makes it clear in a few suttas, it is possible. If your mind is very well developed, it is possible But for most of us, that's just not where we're at, except possibly in the middle of a long meditation retreat. Sometimes you can get to that point. But for most of us, our mind is not well developed enough to catch it at that subtle of a stage. So most of us are working at the next step. So when Vedana has already happened, we've already labeled the experience as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And then what we're doing is we're trying to stop the manifestation of distorted perceptions and concepts about that feeling, about that sensation. So we're trying to stop it before it spins out into sanya, before it spins out into distorted concepts and ideas about the experience. Okay.
Thank you, Bhante. And Ela is asking, what could be an example of right/true perception without distortions?
Anicca sanya, the recognition that all things are impermanent. That's a great example. Okay.
Great. And that was the last question for now, unless there's another question that pops up. All right, seems like that's all for today. So thank you very much, Bhante, for this beautiful teaching. I have particularly enjoyed this sutta, and it seems like people also have. John keeps asking where is Stan. Stan will appear soon. This should be even an extra motivation for you to tune in every morning and every evening at 8 a.m. for sutta study, and in the evening for meditation, followed by Dharma discussion. And at a certain point, Stan might be showing up too. This weekend, we will also have our first weekend meditation retreat. So there will be some extra sessions throughout the day. And we will also be doing chanting of the Ratana Sutta like we did last Sunday. We will create the special YouTube sessions today, actually. So you'll be able to see them this evening. And I think that's all. We will be continuing every morning, every evening until the end of the pandemic. So we'll be uploading more sutta sessions and more evening discussions. So if you have particular topics that you're interested in exploring, or even particular suttas, please let us know. Send us an email at info, I-N-F-O, @buddhistinsights.com. So you can shoot us an email and just write, I would like to discuss this topic, or I really like this sutta and I think it would be of benefit for other people to study, or I would like to understand this sutta better. So then we can see if we can make it happen. And Mehmet is saying, can I ask a last question? I think so. Yeah, go for it. John says, we need some guest stars, cats, for instance. Well, John, you'll be very happy to know that we're also setting up, arranging a little panel with Bhante Sujato and Bhante Akaliko from Australia. So that will be coming up soon, eventually. So that will be on, I believe, Zoom. We will create it. So that's probably better than guest stars like Stan or dogs, as Yudi is suggesting.
Well, we don't have any dogs, so that would be challenging. We could try chickens.
Yeah, exactly. Chicken guest stars. John is happy about the great news, and Mehmet is asking, so the last question of today is, so an enlightened being also has sanya, but a right one, which leads to feeling, but not to proliferation and suffering?
So enlightened beings still appear to manifest the 5 khandhas, at least from our perspective. We see something that looks like the 5 khandhas, the 5 components of body and mind. but they have no attachment to them. They have no concept of self in relation to them. They recognize that the five khandhas are insubstantial, they're impermanent, they are empty of inherent self-existence. They recognize the five khandhas as a conditional manifestation. They recognize them as sankhata, as sankharas, as conditional phenomena. So they're not fooled by them. They see them in their true nature. They see the inherent emptiness of the five khandhas. So yes, there is sanya, but it's not the distorted misperception that we so often fall into. But they see the sanya process and they're not fooled by it. They see it for what it is, so they're not trapped by it. There's a really lovely book by Bhante Nyanananda called, actually there's a few that he wrote that are really worth reading. Basically everything by Bhante Nyanananda is worth reading, by the way. So that's Katu Kurunde Nyanananda. One is called Concept and Reality in Early Buddhist Thought. It's a very interesting book. And another one is called The Magic of the Mind. And in The Magic of the Mind, he plays heavily on the simile of the magician's trick, which the Buddha uses when he's talking about the nature of the five khandhas, actually. So the magician's trick, the simile here is that when you see a stage magician perform a trick, the first time you see it, you're fooled by it. It actually looks like they're doing something real. So the classic example is the magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. It actually looks like they're making a rabbit appear out of an empty hat. That's actually just a trick. They just hid the rabbit somewhere where you couldn't see it at first. So they're not actually making a rabbit appear out of an empty hat. It just looks that way because we don't understand what's happening. But once we understand the trick, then even though the magician keeps performing the trick, we're no longer fooled. We no longer think that a rabbit is being pulled out of an empty hat. We now understand that what's happening is actually completely normal, completely mundane. It just appears to be a rabbit appearing out of nothing when looked at in a certain way. So it's the same. So us ordinary unenlightened beings, we have a misperception of reality, which means it appears a certain way to us. Just like the person who sees the magician and actually thinks that the rabbit is being pulled out of thin air. But the awakened being knows the trick. So they see the same thing that we're seeing, but they see it as illusory. They see it as empty. They see through the trick, so they're not fooled by it. They know that the rabbit is not actually being pulled out of thin air. They know that the magician is not actually materializing a rabbit out of nothingness. They're not fooled. So in the same way, an enlightened being sees reality as it is. And one element of reality is sanya. But an enlightened being is not fooled by sanya. They just see it for what it is. Okay?
Thank you. Mehmet keeps asking, or an enlightened being doesn't have feelings?
So once again, an enlightened being still has the five khandhas. They're just not fooled by them. They're not trapped by them. They have no desire and no delusion in relation to the five khandhas. So they're not limited or defined by the five khandhas. So there's another sutra where the Buddha says that an awakened being cannot be defined in terms of the five khandhas. They also cannot be defined apart from the five khandhas. But that's more than enough to talk about on another day, so I'm not going to get started on that one today. We don't have time for that. So I think if there's no other questions, we can go ahead and end it there for today.
Yes, all right. That was it. Catalina just says this class was intrinsically connected to what we're experiencing right now, trying to build an imaginary scenario of our future after this crisis, a future we don't know and want to grasp on.
So you think there's a future?
Well, that will be for a different session. Thank you so much. Rupa says, this has been wonderful. Yes, we've had all a great time. So thank you so much again, Bhante, and thank you all. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Oh, we have another last question from someone present.
I see. This is easy to see the roses. How about the thought? Why is it slow?
So it's the same. It's just more challenging for us because it's more personal. We tend to have a much stronger self-identity with our thoughts, with our mental experiences. So it's usually more difficult for us to recognize the process. But actually, the Buddha defines thoughts as external sense objects, just the same as sight and sound are. So there is the mind, and the mind perceives thoughts, the same as the eye perceives sights. So you can notice this during meditation practice, actually. You notice that there is the awareness, and the awareness notices that sometimes a thought or a mental object seems to just appear and then disappear. So we're not creating those thoughts. They just come and go on their own. Just as while you're sitting there, sound comes and goes on its own. What makes it a little more confusing with thoughts is that there's two kinds of thoughts. There's the kind which we actively produce, and there's the kind which just come and go based on causes and conditions. And in the beginning, we often can't tell the difference between the two. So a thought floats across the mind, and maybe it's a horrible, disgusting, nasty thought, and we think, I am a horrible, disgusting, nasty person who thinks such terrible things. But that's actually not true. It's just a thought that's appeared in the mind based on past causes and conditions. But we're not creating that thought. So we're not doing any karma. We're just observing the effects of past karma. But we're not doing anything horrible in this moment. We're just seeing something horrible floating across the mind. It's different, though, when we actively produce thoughts, because then we're both creating the karma and experiencing the karma in the same moment. So this is what makes a little bit harder with thought as opposed to the other sensory objects. Do you understand? Okay. So I think we should end for the day.
All right. Thank you all once again. See you this evening at 7:30 p.m.
Okay.
Bye-bye.